Good day to you. Hello. Today is another ramble. I'd like to think it's better than that, but it's not. But it's still staying with the hard questions that have come my way. And today, I would like to go with the question, why is God allowing this virus to keep going when lots of us are praying to him to stop it? And I thought this was a really good question, one that's terribly current affairs, but it's also kind of important discussion around suffering and prayer and patience and our relationship with God and the nature of intercession and all of that stuff. So it's quite an interesting kind of place to kind of dig into and have a think about. And as ever, the caveat is, this is my best guess as a follower. This is not the truth according to the magisterium of the church. And I so, you can take this with a pinch of salt if you want. But kind of this comes also after kind of quite a long time of being a man of prayer and also being a kind of bumbling but sometimes earnest, sometimes pretty useless follower of Jesus. So I think the obvious place to start, well, actually, no, not the obvious place. The place to start actually is I would recommend, before you listen to this, to listen to my last video, which is why do bad things happen to good people. Because I think that's an interesting reflection on suffering and God's relationship with the world and our relationship with God, that I think is actually a foundation for how we relate to frustration and despair and all of the hard part of what it means to be alive, really, and how to be an unknowing follower of Jesus. But I'd like to continue that conversation as we go into this discussion about prayer with a particular focus on intercession. So let's start with thinking about, well, what's prayer then? I think I'd like to say what it's not, first of all. I think the real trap we can get into, and I think this is similar to what we talked about in my last discussion, is if we think that our relationship with God is kind of transactional, in a sort of, if I'm good, you'll do good things for me. If I'm bad, you'll do bad things for me. And that, I think, is the deep trap of prayer. To think that actually, God, I've been good, why are bad things happening? If we get into that, we're completely misunderstanding the nature of the Christian life. Jesus says very directly to his followers, take up your cross and follow me. What's your cross? I don't know what your cross is. What is that aspect of suffering that crucifies you, that leads you into resurrection? I don't know what it is for you. I've got an inkling of what it is for me. But in the end, we are still, all of us, called to follow in suffering, to follow through suffering, to be transformed through resurrection out of suffering. That's actually what we mean by discipleship. So bringing that principle home, we then come to Jesus talking about prayer. Disciples say, how do we pray? And what does Jesus say? Well, he comes up with what we now know as the Lord's Prayer. First of all, what he does is he says, don't pray like the hypocrites. Don't do it for show. Don't do it full of fancy words. So it's not about the volume of words. It's not about the posturing, the posing, the formulas that we think make prayer good. And then he tells us this simple prayer, which of course, because it's Jesus, has hidden depth to it, which I'd like to pull out. So don't be like that. Don't be like the hypocrites, but pray like this. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread and forgive us our debts as we've forgiven our debtors, etc. But I think I'd like to focus more on that front end of the prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. cat approaching me. Come to join in prayer. To me, the first principle of a life of prayer, it centres on that idea. God, let your name be honoured. And you know what? The real ambiguity of praying that is we haven't the faintest idea sometimes about what honours God, about how God will be glorified. We think that the best way for God to be glorified is for good things to happen. But we also know that we have a God whose purposes emerge through the acts of great wickedness. The cross is the evidence of that. That he has this ability to subvert the awful and turn it into resurrection. And so on some level we have to pray open-ended. We have to say, God, may you be honoured in this world. And what that means, I think, too, is an attitude of submission, an attitude of the acceptance that God may do something that doesn't suit us, that isn't our will being done. Which brings us neatly, of course, into your kingdom come, your will be done. How will his kingdom come? Well, I've already alluded to that. When Jesus calls his disciples to follow him, he rapidly moves as he approaches the cross to saying, take up your cross. And as such it was. You look at the life of Peter. Peter is crucified. When Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, Jesus literally knows this is how Peter will follow him. How awful is that? And I mean, therein lies the issue. We are called into the purpose of God, and the purpose of God is to engage with the world as it is, to bring his kingdom in, to subvert the wickedness and to make righteousness rule. And so we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So in praying that, we're joining ourselves into the purpose and work of God. And this, I think, is the deeper riches of what prayer is. It is not really coming to God with lists. It's actually, my best word for it is alignment. A joining ourselves with God, of submitting ourselves to his way, and of bringing ourselves into that world. All right, so having said all of that, our first question is, however, why is God allowing this virus to keep going when lots of us are praying to him to stop it? Well, the hard part of life is we live in a world that is a tough place to be. And the irony, I suppose, of intercession is you have to have a problem to intercede about it. And there is, of course, always a gap between the event and the solution. Intercession is the bit that happens in the middle. Now, we're never, ever, I don't think, in this world going to see a perfect life. We're not. We live within judgment, if you like. We live within difficulty. We live with our brokenness, and we live with salvation at work. But I would also say it's not like God's left us. It's not like the skill and capability of humanity given by God are doing nothing. I mean, in fact, we're seeing the best efforts of government, the best efforts of science, the best efforts of logistical management in an amazing vaccination program. I was just watching a YouTube video earlier by a channel called SciShow, and they pointed out actually that it's taken about 30 or 40 years worth of work to get to the point where we could have this thing we call an mRNA vaccine. So actually it hasn't been done in 1 year, it's been done in 30, 40 years to get to the point where we have vaccines that work against a virus like this. So Yeah, it's a bad thing, but we're not forsaken. So God is answering our prayer. It's just that we wish we didn't have problems in the first place. Well, fine. But that time isn't yet. There will come a point where we won't need to intercede anymore, and God will wipe away every tear. But in the meantime, we have to accept that there will always be a gap between the event, the prayer, and the solution. In this case, we're blessed by a God who's given us the time and preparation in vaccine development to come up with something pretty amazing. To live in a world where we're not subjected to the rigours and difficulties of rampant illness. So maybe we just have to accept we always live in the in-between, and intercession with the God who intervenes is always going to be a place of pleading for those who are broken and hurting. But they're still broken and hurting. So that's my best guess. Thank you for listening.